Dear friends, the Catechism of the Catholic Church reminds that the Eucharist is the source and summit of Christian faith. Yet, unfortunately, we have heard numerous questions about the Eucharist, like is Jesus really present in the Eucharist? Or can the sacrifice of Jesus be repeated at every Eucharist? And many more. So how can we understand the Eucharist in its fullness? We recall the story of the two disciples journeying to Emmaus after the resurrection. It is important to observe how Jesus explained to them the meaning of the events that has taken place in Jerusalem. Luke says he explained to them everything using the scriptures, that is the Old Testament. Yes, that is the key, to read the words and deeds of Jesus in continuity with the Old Testament. One of the intrinsic features of the Bible is its continuity, a continuity that keeps getting richer and clearer as the history of salvation unfolds and progresses. Pope Benedict XVI reminds, Jesus, the Messiah, was a Jew, and his words and deeds can be understood only in his context, geography, family, religious understanding, friends and customs. We then have to begin with the Old Testament and other Jewish literatures of the time to understand the profundity of the Eucharist. Let us begin by analyzing the expectation of the first century Jews about the Messiah. There was obviously the group of zealots who expected the Messiah to be a political leader who would overthrow the Romans. But from the Hebrew scriptures, the Jews of the time expected the coming of the Messiah as a new exodus to a new promised land led by a new Moses. We can see references to it as early as in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 18 verses 15 through 18, where Moses says, Yahweh your God will raise up a prophet like me. Obviously, he is speaking of the new Moses. Hence, Jeremiah speaks of a new covenant. Prophet Isaiah, Ezekiel and Haggai refer to a new temple. Jesus' teaching on the bread of life in John and the institution of the Eucharist are to be understood against these messianic expectations. Hence, there are three fundamental aspects about the Eucharist founded in the Old Testament, namely, Eucharist as the new Passover, Eucharist as the bread of presence, and Eucharist as the new heavenly manna. We shall discuss only the third aspect, Eucharist as the heavenly manna. What was manna? The book of Exodus speaks of the exclamation of the Hebrews seeing the food from heaven, manhu, means what is this? Hence, the food that rained from heaven was called manna. We can highlight some of the features of this heavenly food. Firstly, manna and related quails fell from heaven not through the work of Moses, but miraculously it was Yahweh who fed them with the daily ration of manna, as Jesus says in the Gospel of John. Secondly, manna was rained down each day except on Sabbath, and each one could gather exactly as much as he or she needed. Each one was given according to his or her requirement. Thirdly, manna was given to the Israelites only when they were in Exodus for 40 years. They did not need it in Egypt before the Exodus or in the promised land after it. Manna was the food of the Exodus, a guarantee of God's providence. Fourthly, manna tasted like a wafer made of honey. The promise of Yahweh in Exodus chapter 3 was, I will lead you to a land flowing with milk and honey. Hence, the honey-tasting manna was the foretaste of the land that was awaiting them at the end of the Exodus. Fifthly, manna was the temporal food for mortals, and all those who ate it, including Moses, died. Finally, Yahweh instructed Moses to preserve a measure, an omer of manna for the future generations to see. In fact, other than the stone tablets, manna and the rod of Aaron that blossomed were the other two objects preserved in the Ark of the Covenant that was placed in the Holy of Holies in the Temple of Solomon. The Israelites had different suggestions about manna. Some believed that the manna existed from the beginning of the world, from the time of creation, and was preserved in heaven, from where it was rained down during the Exodus. The psalmist in Psalm 78 sings that manna is the food of angels and it was given to humans in the desert. Majority of the Jews believed that the Messiah would bring back manna from the heavenly table. In all of this, the common element is its origin, that it is from heaven. Yes, manna is indeed the heavenly food. Now we turn to the New Testament. There is an interesting passage that sheds some light on our discussion. It is in the Gospel of Matthew and Luke, the Lord's Prayer. The second part of the prayer begins, "Give us this day our daily bread." Unfortunately, when translating from Greek, the meaning of an important word is overlooked, that is, epiousios. It is translated as daily in both the Gospels. Surprisingly, this word is not used elsewhere before, and hence the meaning is not very clear. One among many of the proposed meanings is supernatural or supersubstantial. Hence, the prayer can be rephrased as, "Give us this day our supernatural bread," which then obviously refers to the heavenly manna. Saints Jerome, Cyril of Jerusalem, Cyprian, and others were convinced of this meaning. If we uphold this translation, which is more probable, then we are praying for the daily manna during our daily earthly exodus. We know that Jesus has begun the new exodus that will be climaxed at his second coming. Jesus was teaching us to pray for our daily share of supernatural food, which is the new manna. Another element of this prayer is the pronoun we. We are praying for our daily bread, not mine. This is because we are journeying together as a community of believers, like the Israelites in the desert, to our promised land. Now let us move on to the Gospel of John. John uses several allusions of Old Testament figures in the Gospel like Abraham, Jacob, Moses, and David. Most prominent among them is none other than Moses, which he uses 13 times. John takes utmost care in narrating Jesus as the new Moses according to the Jewish expectations, but clearly underscoring the superiority of Jesus over Moses. To recall the feeding of the Israelites in the desert, John narrates the feeding of the 5,000 before beginning the discourse on the bread of life. Did the audience of the Gospel of John understand who Jesus was? The answer is yes. That is why John explains in the following words about their acclamation. This is truly the prophet, and further he says that they wanted to make him king. Their demand for further signs in verse 30 is the expression of their desire to be doubly sure that they have the Messiah amidst them. Jesus, instead of providing with another stunning miracle, talks about the new manna that will give life to the world. Their request, "Lord, give us this bread always," is an indication that up to this point they have understood Jesus and they are together. Now we enter the crisis point as Jesus identifies himself as that bread, the new manna. Obviously, the audience was shocked. They did not expect a person to be the food. As C.S. Lewis comments, they could have seen Jesus as a liar or a lunatic or truly as what he was claiming to be. In addition, Jesus further explains without any analogy or metaphor what he meant, which can be paraphrased as, "I am the heavenly manna for the new exodus that has come down from heaven. Those who eat this manna, that is my body and my blood, will have eternal life. Not like the manna in the desert, those who ate it died, including Moses." It is interesting also to note that the phrase "eat and will live forever, other than here, is seen only in Genesis chapter 3, verse 22, speaking about eating the fruit of the tree of life. Therefore, the allusion is that eating the new manna, the body of Jesus, will result in life like that at the creation before the fall, in total union with God. Leviticus chapter 17, verse 11 prohibits drinking of blood, saying, life of the flesh is in blood. Jesus, by inviting to drink his blood, is inviting to share in his life and resurrection. He makes it a condition to be part of him. Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you will not have eternal life. In Exodus chapter 24, verse 10, after Moses, Aaron, Nadab and Abihu with the 70 elders encountered God, and after that there is a beautiful phrase, they saw God and they ate and drank. The invitation of Jesus is to behold God and to eat and drink. He is not calling for a symbolic action. Rather, it is as real as the manna in the desert. Eucharist is physical and tangible food for our exodus. Hence, Augustine suggests to adore the Eucharistic bread before eating it. In John chapter 6, verse 63, it is spirit that gives life, while the flesh is of no avail, makes it further clear that it is not the dead flesh that he is offering, rather the resurrected, living flesh of Jesus in the Spirit. Before we conclude, it is interesting to see the reference to manna in the book of Revelation chapter 2, verse 17. John, speaking to the church of Pergamum, speaks of the hidden manna as the reward for the victors. What does he mean? One of the meanings can be found in the book of 2 Maccabees, chapter 2, verses 4 to 7. It explains that Jeremiah has hidden the ark that contained the manna during the destruction of the temple of Jerusalem in 587 BC, and it will remain unknown until God gathers his people. There can be another meaning. Jesus, the new manna, has ascended into heaven as he is hidden until his second coming. Hence, the promised reward for the victor is eternal life with Jesus, the hidden manna. Did the disciples and early Christians understand what Jesus said and did? The answer is, the understanding came gradually, as we mentioned at the beginning about the story of the disciples traveling to Emmaus. Jesus unfolded the link between his life and the scriptures to them, and they recognized him at the breaking of the bread. We too recognize Jesus at the breaking of the bread, at every Eucharistic celebration as our new manna. However, there is a twist in the story of the disciples. As soon as they recognize him, Jesus disappears from them. They now have the new manna with them. They recognized his presence and being sustained by it. The disciples understand this and they do not waste time in searching for him. Rather, return to Jerusalem the very same night, no more downcast, but rejoicing. The line between being downcast and rejoicing is recognizing Jesus, our new manna, in the breaking of the bread. In summary, we have glanced into the Old Testament for comprehending the meaning of the Eucharist in its totality. Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament expectations of the Messiah and began the new Exodus, eschatology that has already begun. He, the new Moses, has provided us with our daily sustenance of heavenly food like Moses in the desert. The difference, however, is that Moses was only instrumental while Yahweh provided the manna, whereas the new Moses, Jesus himself, is the new manna and gives eternal life. No one starved during the Exodus in the desert. Manna was available to all the Israelites in spite of their failures and sinfulness, as we read in the book of Nehemiah. They did not deserve and had gone after idols, but manna fell from heaven for everyone, just sufficient for each day. The new manna is the heavenly assurance for us in our despair and darkness. It is a means that strengthens us in our earthly journey and becomes a bond between those who eat it and Jesus himself. Hence, the invitation at the Last Supper, take and eat, is an invitation to be part of Jesus, the new manna. This is the same invitation we hear at every Eucharist, to eat the new manna and be part of Jesus. May God bless each of us.